4, 3. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lee Patterson and I'm the coordinator for Child Friendly City programme. That's a partnership between Cardiff Council and UNICEF to embed children's rights. It's really important that we provide these opportunities for pupils to link with city leaders, and today is one of those events where you can hear directly from the Director of Education and the Cabinet Member for Education. So how's it going to work? First of all, there's a chat function in the right hand side, and you can open that chat function and you can actually drop in questions and comments. What we want questions on is all to do with the plans to reopen schools and move into the recovery phase after the virus that we're experiencing. So we would encourage you to have questions about the reopening of schools. What we can't necessarily answer are specific questions about specific schools, because each head teacher and the team will be working on all the details on a school by school basis. But Councillor Merry and Nick Batchelar will be able to provide lots of information around what the plans look like currently and what the challenges are and how they're planning to overcome them. So in the meantime, what we want you to do is maybe take a couple of minutes. In the chat, you'll see that there's some links to surveys. And it's just going to take you 1 or 2 minutes to complete that survey. So if you have a look in the chats function, click on the survey that's pertinent to you. So depending on what year group you're in, there's a slightly different question for you. We want you to complete that. It'll open up in a different page. Make sure you don't close us down, otherwise you might lose us. Spend a minute or two doing that, and then we need you to come back, and then I'll introduce you to Nick Batchelar and Councillor Merry. That's great. We can see you all completing that survey, so thanks very much for taking the time. We've also want to say thanks to the 3,500 pupils that completed the Children's Commissioner survey, and we've got all that information now, so we have a better understanding of what people are experiencing across Cardiff from the age of 8 to 18. So thank you very much if you completed that survey as well. That's really, really important that we hear your views. So I'm now going to hand over to Nick Batchelar, who's going to tell you a little bit about his role and introduce himself. So, Nick, over to you.
Morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webcast. And I look forward in a bit to your questions, and we'll do our best to answer the questions. Can't promise to answer everything. So, my role is as Director of Education. I'm the Senior Paid Officer working for the Council with a responsibility for schools and education and some other services like youth services within Cardiff Council. I'm not a politician. I used to be a teacher, so I've professionally worked in education all my life, and I work very closely with head teachers right across the city, with governing bodies, with other partners in education across Wales, and obviously, in this period, I've been very concerned about how schools are responding to the COVID-19 health crisis. And we're going to come on to talk about the thing that's concerning all of us at the moment, which is the restart of schools, but in a very different way before the end of this month. So I'll say more about that later. But the person I report to is going to talk to you next. That's Councillor Sarah Merry, who is a politician, as she'll tell you. So while I'm involved in some of the big decisions in terms of giving advice and information, I don't take the decisions in our system. Those big decisions about which schools should go where, when some important things should happen, how much money we should spend on this or that aspect of education. That's the concern of the politicians. And with regard to education, that's Councillor Merry, who I'll hand over to now.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name's Sarah Merry, and as Nick has already said, I'm the Cabinet Member for Education, and I'm also the Champion of Children's Rights at the Council. I'm an elected politician, as Nick has said. I represent Caerdydd ward, which is in the centre of the city. But the party with the most number of councillors after an election decides who the leader of the council is going to be, and then the leader, just like the Prime Minister does, appoints people to their cabinet. So those people have a specific role. So mine is education. There are other people for parks, for children's services, and all the services that the council delivers. And we each take one of those areas, and as Nick says, collectively we make the big decisions about services, and that's part of our role. And if we decide that politically we want to do a particular thing with education, we would go to Nick and say we want to achieve this, how do we do it? And the other part of things that we do is we ask the kind of questions that your parents and your family would be making if somebody was recommending a decision about what was best for your school. So that's our role. I'll pass you back to Nick now.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'll say a bit about the thing we're focusing on this morning, which is how have you been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in Cardiff, and how can we listen to you and get your views about how we should deal with what's coming next? So first of all, I'm going to look back a bit. So if you can cast your minds back to last Christmas. Last Christmas seemed sort of normal. The weather was horrible, and you know we'd had an election just before Christmas. And then schools came back, and I expect, you know, all of you, like all of us, were thinking, oh, well, there's going to be a few surprises this year. But I'm absolutely sure that none of us expected that we'd be dealing with what we have been dealing with. So we got to half term in about February, and we'd all suddenly heard about this place in China, Wuhan, and in the province of Hubei in China, that probably lots of us didn't know much about. And there was some news coverage, but early on, it seemed, certainly if you looked at the news in the United Kingdom, it was about something that was happening somewhere else to other people in the other side of the world. But what we all absolutely know, and if we didn't know it before, we certainly know it now, is that the world is very, very tightly connected now. So before long, the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to creep into Europe. And first, as you know, it went to Italy, and we started watching, I'm sure all of us, with some concern about the awful things that were happening in Italy, particularly to old people and in old people's homes. And then I would have to say none of us were really prepared for the speed and the scale of what we had to do, which was suddenly March the 23rd, close all schools down, close workplaces. So your family lives would have been completely different from that date, because no school, lots of parents having to work at home, lots of concern. And then we entered that first period of so-called lockdown, that phrase that didn't mean anything before, but everyone says lockdown now, don't they? And we did keep some schools open, though, the so-called hub schools, for the children of key workers, people who worked in the health services, the ambulance, the police, prison service, and some other key services. And also for some learners who needed additional support. But that was only out of 123 schools in Cardiff. There were only 24, 25 open. So it was very, very different, and it wasn't really about learning. And then your schools were communicating with you in all kinds of ways, particularly online. And I'm very much aware that that depends on having good IT equipment, good connectivity at home, space to sit and do work and so on. And so it's been a really difficult period for all of you and your families. Schools have worked hard. I genuinely think they have worked really hard to make the best of it, but it's been tough. So then in May, the Minister for Education in Wales, Kirsty Williams, announced that this was May the 15th, middle of May, that she set out an approach to the return of schools in Wales. And that approach stressed safety of everyone, contributing to the national effort to limit the spread of the disease, making sure that whatever we do with the confidence of everyone concerned, and that's parents, carers, staff, and of course you, learners. And then that set, if you like, an approach in Wales, which, as you're probably aware, is different from the approach in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland. Then on the 3rd of June, beginning of June, there was an announcement from Kirsty Williams again that schools in Wales would start welcoming back pupils from the 29th of June for a period of the remaining weeks of this summer term. And that is what we're working on now, and I'm sure many of your questions will be about this, though I'm happy to talk about any other things as well. So that notion of the school restart was badged with the phrase check in, catch up and prepare. Let me just say a bit about each of those words. Check in is the idea of making contact again both with your peer group, with your friends, with your classmates, but also with your teachers. Now, you may have had contact with teachers online, but it's about reconnecting. So checking in is that sense of socially connecting, so you're not isolated. Secondly, catching up. That doesn't mean the focus on catching up learning. Primarily, it's about reconnecting. It's not intended to be an intensive 3 or 4 week crammer period where you have to try and learn all the things that you've not been able to learn since lockdown started in March. And then the third word in that is prepare, and it's to start thinking together about what school's going to be like in September. Because one thing I can say with confidence is that it won't be like September was in 2019. It's not going to be a typical normal excuse me, September start. So that was a really difficult, finely balanced decision, but it was guided by the concern to be safe, first of all. And obviously, you all know that the rate of incidence of the disease in Wales is declining, and it hasn't gone yet. And Wales is taking, I think, an appropriately cautious approach. And so shops aren't open today in Wales, they are in England and so on. If you want to go to Primark and join the queues to buy clothes, you'd have to come to England because you can't do that in Wales. Personally, I think that's sensible. Secondly, there's clearly a lot of concern about you, young people. The longer schools aren't functioning, the bigger the risk to you in terms of your ability to learn and develop and thrive and be happy. And I am very aware of the pressures on lots of families and on lots of you. So happy to talk about that. And so it's a difficult judgment. But anyway, what we're now focusing on in Cardiff is making this a good 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks of term. And the reason, let me explain, the reason I'm saying 3-4 weeks is that there's a possibility that the summer term might be extended by a week and you'll have a 2-week October half term in the autumn. That's not 100% certain yet, it's still being discussed. So we're trying to work with schools, and we've published some guidance, and I've very much welcomed the input that some of you have had into how we should organise the return of schools. And I'm happy to say much more in detail, if you like, about what that will look like. But essentially, there will be no more than a third at the maximum of pupils of a school in the school at any one time. So that means for the 3-4 weeks of this term, 2/3 of the pupils in a school won't be in the school, they'll have to be at home. And schools will organise a timetable and a rota of which year groups come in when, and whether they spend a whole day or a half day in school. So it'll be very different. The other thing that's going to be very different, as I'm sure you know, is that we have to do what's called socially distancing in schools, which means 2 metre separation between desks, that you don't share pencils, pens, computers, that you clean every surface regularly, that you minimise the number of contacts you have when you're in school. So you'll find that when you go back in your time at the end of June and in July, you're with a smaller group of pupils, probably about 10 to 15, and that when you go back, you stay with those pupils. So if you're in a secondary school, you will not mix into different subject groups, and you will see far fewer teachers. You may just see one teacher and have contact with one adult through the whole day, and you will not be able to, sadly, move around and socialise in the way that you used to. So lunch times will have to be very controlled. And there will be no hot food in most schools. You'll have to take your own lunch. And transport will be very difficult because the buses aren't all running at the moment. And travelling on buses, you can't pack a bus with every seat full. You have to have separation between people in public transport. So lots and lots and lots of things will be very different. However, the main focus on the return in Wales is what I started with. Check in, catch up and prepare. So I'll stop there for now because that's the school part of this restart, and I'll hand back to Councillor Merry, who'll say a bit more both about schools, young people and about the wider city restart. Sarah, over to you.
Hi. So as Nick has said about the way that the schools will reopen, they will be very different when you go back, and it will be the same when you go back in September. So the virus hasn't gone away. What we have to do is find a way of providing your education, and if you've been in school in a way that's safe and doesn't mean that the virus comes back. I know that lots of you will have different feelings about going back to school. Some of you will be really excited that you'll be seeing people that you know. Some of you may be scared or worried about going back for different reasons. From wondering about how much work you've missed. And it may be that actually you're feeling both scared and excited. And part of the reason why I want to do this seminar today is actually give you a chance to ask questions, and hopefully that will make it easier for you when you go back to school. But also we will find out what are the issues that are worrying people, and we can think about how we actually make it easier for people to go back. So Nick's listed all the ways that school will be different in terms of the ways that people will have to socially distance, go into school, and the cleaning around it. The virus hasn't gone away, and those are the kind of decisions that the council is going to have to make about all the different services that we provide as a council. So waste services changed, and we're slowly trying to return things to a more as the way they were, but they're not there yet, and they won't be for some time. The council also provides the sporting facilities by working with GLL. We provide the highways. There's all the services around things like the castle. All of those are linked to the council, and it's going to be a big job trying to work out the best way of reopening the city, but doing it slowly and doing it safely. So, for example, Nick mentioned that shops in England are open today. They're not yet in Wales, but when they do, we're having to think of ways that the city centre could operate safely. So you would never normally have had a one-way system, would you, walking around the city centre? But things like that are the kind of things that we have to be looking at to make the city safe for people to live in as services start to not get back to normal, because they're not going to be getting back to normal, but as they start to open up again. So I'm sure you've got lots of questions about how your schools are going to be looking. So we'll pass over.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I'm looking at your questions. So we've got 55 questions, a lot. Gracie, goodness, you're asking lots of questions. I can't keep up. So I'm gonna do my best, and I'll try and group the questions together. And so here's a first look. And Sarah, you might like to pick up some of the questions after 10:55, because that's where I've got to so far. So if I start with a nice sort of simple question, but a really powerful one. What will we do when we go into school? Because you've obviously, I think that was an anonymous question, I think, because I've said it's going to be very different. And if you've gone to a hub, if you're one of the young people who've been in one of the 24 hubs, you'll know it's not, it's not like normal lessons. It's more like a summer school. So what will you do? Well, there'll be some learning, and I'm quite sure for some of you in secondary schools, particularly year 10, year 12, there will be, as soon as possible, a real focus on learning and the modules that you've not been able to really deal with in detail through online learning. But in many other ways, I think the experience is going to be very, very different. So I'll touch on a few things. So, for instance, lunch times, I think I've already said, no, you won't be able to go and sort of interact with whoever you like at lunchtime. There will have to be, I mean, if the weather stays nice, then obviously schools can use the outside as much as possible. And I hope very much that some of your learning and your sessions will be outside, because, as you know, the horrible COVID-19 virus does not like the outside. It's much happier nipping from person to person indoors, where on the whole we're much closer, there's much less ventilation, and there isn't so much sunlight. So the more we can be outside, the better, as long as, again, that is socially distanced. So you can't play contact sports, you can't play games which require touch and contact and getting close to other people. So it's going to have to be very tightly managed. As far as lunch goes, Gracie, you asked a question about lunch. It's likely you'll have to eat your packed lunch that you bring from home in school. So there won't be free school meals for pupils on free school meals, because, as you probably know this, we're operating a direct payment system. So the money for the free school meal is going into the family and the parent's bank account, parent or carer's bank account, and then so there won't be any food provided. In 1 or 2 secondary schools it might be different. So you'll probably eat your lunch in your classroom. So it'll be a very different day. It'll feel very different. But obviously, when you're not in school, and Gracie, again, I'm responding to one of your questions, you will be continuing to do online work. Starting schools again doesn't mean that you suddenly stop doing the other stuff that you've been doing online. It's going to be, the word that everyone's using now is blended learning, a mix of being in school and a mix of doing online work at home. And that will continue in September, I'm sure. Emil C has asked a really cracking question, which is this. It's a hard one, and I'm not dodging it. You've raised a question. I can't remember exactly how you said it, so I'm just going from my notes. But basically, different standards, different schools are providing different amounts of online learning in different ways. And your question is, how is this fair? And who's looking at this? And you asked a question here, really good question. Who is responsible for maintaining standards to make sure, not that everything's the same, but that all young people are getting a similar standard of amount of work, quality of response, and so on? That's a really good question. And my answer would be a long list of people. So here's how it works. Clearly, head teachers are responsible for knowing what's going on in their school and knowing what the quality of online support is. Governing bodies need to be informed about what a school is doing, particularly, and I've been saying this to governors, governing bodies need to be briefed about the range and the quality of online learning. Each school has, as you may or may not know, a paid professional educator called a challenge advisor, whose job is to work with the school and the governing body and the local authority. And so obviously, as Director of Education, I need to have confidence that all schools are maintaining a good standard of provision. And you know, it's not breaking any confidence, is to say that I've been contacted during this period by some parents and some local councillors saying, well, we're not sure about what's being offered by this school. I've got a neighbour of mine hasn't been contacted, and so on. And then therefore I report to Councillor Merry on exactly that kind of thing. So there is accountability in the jargon. That's what this question's about. So I know it's a long answer, Emil. I hope it's reasonably clear, but it's an important one at this time. And then I'll do one more, and Sarah, and then perhaps you can pick up some. Transition day. I guess this is from one of you probably in year 6. It's an anonymous question, so I can't put a name on it. Transition day. Normally in the summer term, right now, if you're in a primary school, you're doing all sorts of wonderful things like going on camps and getting other experiences, which is great, and it's really sad that that's not happening. But the other thing that's happening is for year 6 pupils, you have a number of transition days where you go with the other pupils who are moving to the secondary school that you've chosen to go to, and you get to see the school, you get to meet the teachers, you get to meet the other pupils, so that you can start the summer holidays confident that you know what it's going to be like in September. That is really tricky now, because of course that means mixing lots of people who don't normally mix, and that's what we can't do if we're going to stop the virus spreading. So for most schools, there won't be a transition day as such this term, and I and my colleagues are advising schools to actually have the physical transition in September and not to do it now. 1 or 2 schools are trying to find a way of doing it safely. I think that's slightly problematic. I know lots of secondary schools have done some really good online video messaging around what it's like to be in the school, who are the teachers. I've seen some of them. I think they're great. So there's lots of things that can be done online, virtually. So for the most part, there won't be, and I think there shouldn't be, the kind of transition day that you will have known from the past. Lots more questions. Sarah, would you like to take some now?
Hi. I just wanted to comment on the transition to secondary school, because I know that is a really difficult time for a lot of people. They're excited about leaving their old school, but you know, they're nervous about going up to high school. So I think, going back to Nick's point about the transition arrangements, we are trying to work with schools so that they can try and give a virtual transition as well, where you get a chance to meet the teachers and do that kind of engagement online. It's not the same, and I wouldn't claim that it was, but actually it does mean that you have that chance to meet people before September. The thing I picked up on reading through the comments and has already been answered, but I just wanted to come back as well, is that clearly some of you are feeling that it's not been equitable, it's not been the same opportunity for all of you during this period, and that's something that we need to look into and actually find out what schools have done that's really worked and what schools have done that hasn't worked. We can't assume that schools won't have to close again for a period during the winter, for example. That might happen if the virus comes back, and what we do want to make sure is that you get as much of your education as possible. We don't want you to have gaps in your learning, and that's really important to us. There was a question about the start date in September, and I believe, Nick, the start date at the moment in September is exactly the same. Is that correct? Yeah. So that will be as normal, but there is a possibility that you might get an extra week's holiday at the October half term, but that's not been decided as yet. So the other question I was going to pass back to Nick, because that has come up several times, is why are year sixes only going in for 2 weeks and not 4? So I'm going to pass that one back to Nick there, because I don't actually know the answer to that one.
Okay, so right, so if I just pick up that one and then another few themes. Any year group is likely to have, you will go in for some sessions, but you won't go in. Let me be absolutely clear about this. It's not the case that all pupils will be attending school for all the days in all the weeks of this term. You won't. So the head teacher will decide which pupils come in when. So, and they will be allocating days and times for particular year groups. So I'm not sure what the particular circumstances of that question are. So if it's a particular question, we can answer it privately. If whoever's asked it wants to we can do a private reply. So just because the newspapers are talking about schools restarting, please make sure that your parents understand this. You are not going to be going back to school for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday for 4 weeks in this term. None of you will do that, because there isn't enough space, because, as I said at the beginning, only roughly one third of the pupils in each school can safely be in there at any one time. So that's really important. Now, there's a number of questions about safety, so let me just touch on that. Kaina, you've asked a really important question and very thoughtful question, and that's this: how safe will it be in school, and how confident can you be that when you go to school, you won't then take the disease home and affect your family and those you live with? And that's a very important consideration, and that is one of the things I was talking about earlier. That's one of the reasons why Wales is starting schools back after England. It's because it is only when the spread of the virus is at a sufficiently low level that we can have confidence that with social distancing in schools, it will be safe to have that kind of going to school, going home contact. You're quite right, Kaina, that it's possible, if it's not well handled, if it's not managed properly, that young people going to school maybe find themselves, but they may end up as carriers of the virus. And that's what we have to stop, which is why all the arrangements in school that I'll talk about a bit more are so important. So you won't be interacting with lots of other pupils. You won't be able to go and mix with your friends unless they're in the group that you're in. You will see far fewer teachers. You will mostly be in one room, not in lots of rooms. At lunchtime, you will have to eat your packed lunch at your desk. You won't be in the canteen. One of you has asked a question about incredibly busy canteens. Well, we can't have that. So canteens cannot be rammed full at lunchtime with huge queues. That can't happen. Somebody said, will there be cleaners? Yes, we've put in place a very tight regime of cleaning so that all schools will be cleaned twice a day, and there will be lots of hand sanitizer for all of you to wash your hands, sanitize your hands. There will be very clear marking and separation so that there'll be one-way systems, because obviously everyone knows that schools, corridors in schools get very busy, and so one-way systems is a way of making sure you don't have that sort of contact. And Kaina, you've asked about PPE, personal protective equipment, gloves and masks. Now, there's been lots of discussion about this, lots and lots and lots. And the medical advice from the Chief Medical Officer in Wales is that it is not necessary for all young people to wear masks. except in some circumstances. So if you are travelling on a bus or in a taxi to school, or you're in a car with other people who are not part of your immediate family group, then you should wear a mask, and we will be making masks available for pupils. But it's not essential that they're worn all the time. For younger pupils in particular, very young children, it isn't appropriate anyway. Some teachers will wear masks, and some teachers will wear protective equipment, that is those full face visor masks and gowns and gloves, if, for example, they need to provide care to a pupil. So if, for instance, somebody falls over and cuts their knee, then the member of staff who's the first aider will need to get close to them to sort out their knee. And she or he, the member of staff doing that, will wear a visor mask. So all schools will have full PPE, but they won't all wear it all the time. So safety is hugely important, absolutely right. And I think the other thing I'd say is this, and this is where you can all help massively. Safety isn't really about what equipment you've got, or what markings there are on the floor. It's basically about attitudes and behaviour. And as you've seen with adult society, a huge amount depends on how people regard each other. And the whole point about social distancing is that we understand and respect that other people need to stay apart, and we need to stay apart from other people. So, for example, if you go out in a park, it's quite noticeable that some people are very good at social distancing. So if you're walking along with your family and there's some other people coming towards you, people who are doing social distancing well will make sure they don't come close to you. You'll avoid each other. But there are some people who frankly are selfish and dangerous, who just keep walking and they expect you to get out of the way. Runners in particular, they make me cross. Runners seem to think that everyone needs to get out of their way. I don't think that's the case. So it's how we all do this that matters. And it's going to take lots of self-control, lots of self-discipline, and lots of consideration for other people. And it's hugely important. So in an odd kind of way, you've asked about equipment, and I'm saying, yeah, there is equipment, but actually the main tool we have for doing this is ourselves and our attitudes and how we behave. And I'm sorry if I sound like a teacher saying that, but that's true. And then Ishan, you've asked a question about September. So good question. What will we start at the beginning of September, mid-September, end of September? What should we expect? Well, I think you'll find out more when you do start talking to your teachers again in end of June and July. But for sure, September won't be back to normal. And so I think the experience you're going to have in July will be very similar to the experience you'll have in September. It will be a blend of learning at home and learning in school. It will mean that life is very different for you. It will mean that the organisation of schools, in the ways I've described, will continue probably for quite a long time. And as Councillor Merry said earlier, it's possible, and I don't want to be a doomster, it's possible that schools will have to close again if there is a rise in the spread of the virus in our area. I'm not saying that will happen, but it could happen, and we need to plan for that. So the future is going to be very difficult, and I'd be very happy also to talk with you, but I'll pass back to Sarah now, about the longer term. So one or two of you have asked questions about, will our whole education be affected by this? And what might the consequences of this be for our lives in the future? Sarah, I'll hand back to you, and then probably we need to go back to Lee to round up.
There's one question there about the R race, and and if it goes down, whether the 2 metre rule will be changed and whether everything could be back to normal by September. I think that question is a very good one. It kind of underlines the difficulty that we've actually got at the moment, because what we want to be able to do is be able to say in 6 months' time your school will look like this, and that's how we normally plan things. We like people to know what's expected and for schools to know exactly what they need to do at a set time, but just sometimes because of circumstances you have to accept that things may change. So at the moment the instruction is about staying 2 metres away. That's an unbalanced risk assessment that is being given because of the scientific information that they have. That might change, and if it does change, obviously that will make a difference with how our schools operate. The challenge that the governments have got, though, is they want to keep that R rate down. So for everybody not quite sure what that means, that is the rate by which people are passing the infection on, and we need to keep that low, because if it starts to go up, more people will be getting infected again, and then we will be back in a situation where we have to close things down. So there are times we just have to say that we're going to have to look at what's happening, listen to the advice that's been given, and as Nick has said, the main factor is going to be about keeping you all safe. So one of the other questions on there is about hand sanitizers around schools. I mean, absolutely. And again, that puts a responsibility on people to actually use the hand sanitizers, and that is really important because that's one of the big things that can reduce the way the virus gets passed on. There are other specific questions about, like, how many days will we go into school, for example. All that is having to be worked up by individual schools to some extent, because some of our schools are bigger than others and can have more of their pupils in. You know, some of our schools are modern ones with more than one entrance, some of them are Victorian with only one way in and out. So all of those things are going to affect how many pupils can be in school all at once, and that's the plans that your head teacher and your school will be working up on. In terms of lunch, I think we have actually answered that in the sense that it won't be lunch as normal, and there will not be normal school meals provided at the moment. If you're only in school for a short time, you won't necessarily need lunch in any case, and if people do need to be in over lunchtime, it will be packed lunches for that reason. So I think you've all asked brilliant questions. It's so many questions and we haven't really answered them all. It'd be good to find a way of sending you answers to questions that have been asked and we haven't been able to answer now. So are we passing back to Lee now? Yeah, so we're going back to Lee.
Hi, thanks, Councillor. So as Councillor Merry has said, we've had over 200 questions submitted, and we were never going to be able to answer all those questions. One of the key questions that is a really important question that we need to address is how are we communicating important information with all young people? And we do recognise that different people have different needs, and so we are working with our qualities team to make sure that we provide information in a range of ways, including with BSL. So we'll be producing frequently asked questions and answers in a range of ways, including BSL and possibly other languages after we take some advice. And hopefully that will provide people with the information to make really good decisions and feel comfortable and confident about going back to school at the right time. So we're coming to the end of our webinar, and we want to thank Nick Batchelar and Councillor Merry for taking the time to provide the information and respond to your questions. What's going to happen next? Well, we're really keen to make sure that pupils are at the heart of decision making and planning a response to the challenges that we face. And one way that you can get involved is by joining a pupil task group. So Nick and Sarah have set up a range of task groups with adults involved, and they're very keen to make sure that pupils have the same opportunity. So if you want to be involved in that task group, which would meet every few weeks, talk about what the current experience of school is, and also to sort of comment on future plans, all you need to do is send a very quick email suggesting that you want to be part of that. So we have your contact details, and you send that email to, and we'll put it into the chat, Child Friendly Cardiff at cardiff.gov.uk. So we really encourage you to be part of that task group. And in the meantime, we'll share this link with all head teachers to make sure that all schools are considering the questions that you've raised and some of the responses that you heard, to make sure that their plans reflect your concerns and needs. So we'll put the child-friendly email into the chat, and thank you very much indeed for all who attended and took part. So keep safe.